Hi, I'm Gene Preuss. In this lecture, we're going to talk about public education between 1860 and 1890. And this is when the ideas of public education, the necessity of public education that have been floating around for many decades, finally begins to take hold and is actually began to be implemented on a larger scale. Some of the questions we'll discuss: what were the effects of the Civil War on public schooling? How did education evolve during the Reconstruction period following the Civil War? And how did education adopt to new ethnic groups that were coming in to the nation? There are many events that happened during this period. And so there's a lot on the timeline here. We'll discuss some of these during the lecture. And if you want to come back here or download the PowerPoint that goes along with this, you can. But just know that you see a lot of change happening in the United States during this period because it's a Civil War period. It was a great deal of turmoil, upset, and renewal. In the South, we've talked about this before, the period leading up to the Civil War, there's a couple of misconceptions about the South. One of those is that education, we were talking about the development of the common school, was widespread. It really wasn't. In the South, education was largely based upon what the individual family determined the child needed. And what they could afford. So you have wealthy planters who in many cases were sending their children for education outside of the state, outside of the South, or even outside of the country, sending them to schools in England, sending them to schools up north, because there really weren't that many schools, academies, places to get a good education in the South. So there was education. There were some very educated people, but many of them had been educated elsewhere. And it was kind of seen as a kind of a mark of your wealth to be able to send your school to Europe for education. Now, that's not to say that none of the poor people had access to schools. There were some schools, especially in urban areas, cities who could afford schools. But if you lived out on the farm, it was a very kind of a European attitude towards education, that it was based upon wealth and a sign of wealth. North Carolina was an exception to this. There were some schools, some universities in North Carolina, so it wasn't totally absent from the South. Now, another misconception that people have is that African Americans weren't educated in the South, and that is not exactly true. So what you do see is some schools, especially for free blacks. However, some slaves are going to be educated as well. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. We're not talking about college or university, although sometimes that did happen. Especially, you'll find records of planters who took their children of mixed race, acknowledged that they were their children, and send them off to Europe or to outside of the South to be educated. However, for the most average slave, there was some educational incentive on the part of masters because they didn't want their slaves totally ignorant, especially the ones in positions of responsibility. Say that you're a planter, for example, and you want your slaves to take a bundle of animals, crops to market. You don't want them to be cheated. You don't want them to fall prey to some unscrupulous trader who is going to undervalue the product so they can buy them for less. You want to get the best dollar value. So you want your slaves to be able to read, write, and do mathematics well enough so that they can conduct business. So there was some education provided. However, what we normally mean, I believe, when we think about slaves not being allowed to have education, is that after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 in Virginia, the South began passing laws across the region prohibiting slaves from being educated. Now, on the other hand, plantation owners could do pretty much whatever they wanted. And so plantation owners, in many cases, did continue to educate their slaves in the same way. Another consideration they had was the religious factor. They wanted continued religious and moral training and obedience training through Christianity. And so they encouraged slaves to have their own church services. In many cases, they wanted slaves to preach those church services. So you had to have slave ministers who were able to read the Bible, able to write their sermons. So there was some limited education still occurring, even though these laws were passed. That's not to say it was widespread, but it wasn't completely eliminated. After the war, or during the war, after the war begins, how is public education affected? Well, it depends on where you're talking about. So in areas of the North that were free from war, there might be very little change at all. However, you have to consider that in many of these states and regions and counties, even though they weren't battlefields, men were still volunteering to go and fight in the Civil War. So a lot of times young people, boys as young as 15, or maybe even younger, would go off and volunteer to serve in the war. So they're taken out of schools, they're not attending schools. Certainly areas that were affected by the war are going to be impacted, but many times that didn't happen. And so children left behind who remained at home would continue to go to school. But there was, to say that it did not affect them at all would not be accurate, because in many cases sometimes just the men were gone, or people were gone, and sometimes families were gone following the men at war. So they were certainly going to be affected. Now, you see this on an even bigger scale in the South, because many more of the battles were fought in Southern territory. Many of those areas in the South were affected by the ravages of war. And just like in the North, people were going off to fight in the war, or women and children were following the war to be near their fathers, to support the war. And so they are going to be more severely impacted. The other thing that's impacting them is you got to consider state and local funding. In a lot of the regions in the South, they were severely economically disadvantaged by the war. When the South left the Union, it had no money. There was no basis there was no gold and silver to form the basis for money. And so they had to rely on what they call cotton diplomacy. And this was the ability to buy and sell, or to sell and trade cotton to Europe and Mexico and other areas of the globe where they would buy Southern cotton, although they were severely limited in this effort as well. So many state and local governments found themselves without money, and so it was very hard to run school systems then. In many cases, schools shut down during the war. In the North, one of the benefits of having the South out of the Union was that they were able to pass a bill that had been bogged up by Southern opposition. This was the Morrill Land Grant Act. In this groundbreaking piece of legislation, the federal government finally intervened and began offering land in states that were being newly settled, and in some more established states, offering federal land for sale, and the proceeds of that land sale would go to establish colleges and universities. And so these land grant colleges, many of these are big state colleges today, especially in the Ohio River Valley and the Midwest, took advantage of the Morrill Land Grant Act and established agricultural, mechanical, and state colleges and universities. So it was a ground-shaking event as far as education was concerned. Following the Civil War, during the Reconstruction period, there was a tremendous amount of effort on the part of state and local and federal government to promote education. And so all this talk, all these plans that had erupted since the early days of the Republic could now be implemented through federal intervention. And some of this is what, we think of the Freedmen's Bureau schools, and this is a picture of one of these schools for African American children in the South. The children of slaves and free blacks as well were encouraged to go to these freedmen's schools. Now, the freedmen's schools were not, however, simply limited to African Americans. The Freedmen's Bureau also was reaching out to educating whites, although it was much more successful in the African American community. Many of these teachers, and you see the teacher here in the black dress, were employed by or sent by missionary groups. And these are religious groups, volunteers who are sent down in order to educate, do religious training, and promote education. Many of these worked in the Freedmen's Bureau schools. This is where they got their teachers from. And they too were the subject of a lot of problems because of people who didn't like the idea of education, or people who didn't like the idea of educating African American children. There were some philanthropic funds set up. The George Peabody Fund is one of the most notable. It's headed by Barnes Sears after Peabody's death. And then after Sears' death in 1881, J.L.M. Curry, a Southerner himself, becomes the head of the organization. And so this is going to reach out to Southern schools and provide funds for them to grow and for maintenance and upkeep. However, it was limited to established schools, not to new schools. So unintendedly, it only really affected white schools predominantly because they were the ones that were already in place. Another extension of opportunity was the Second Morrill Land Grant Act. And what this did was this allowed the benefits of the first Morrill Land Grant Act to extend to the South. This is 1890. And so this is the real beginning of what we call the HBCUs as an organization, historically black colleges and universities. About 12 of them were founded as a result of the Second Morrill Land Grant Act. Again, providing the money from the sale of lands, federal lands, to go to establish these colleges and universities, and especially in the South, for African American education. And so just up the 290 highway, you have Prairie View A&M. It is a beneficiary and established as a result of the Second Morrill Land Grant Act. A&M University, Texas A&M in Bryan College Station, was not a benefit of the first Morrill Land Grant Act. It also received money from the Second Morrill Land Grant Act. For education of African Americans in the South, and we've already talked a little bit about this, but besides the federal government, you also had local communities, state organizations founded for the promotion of establishing black schools. And certainly they were aided by the Freedmen's schools, but there was also a lot of resistance, as I said, to the Freedmen's Bureau schools. Many were attacked, some burned, teachers beat up or killed, children attacked, some of them murdered as well. And so there was a lot of resistance to that. You also see the development by African American communities themselves of their own schools. And this has been kind of termed a double taxation on the black community by some educational historians who have said, the African American landowner was paying taxes to support the white schools, but they were also pulling money out of their own pockets to build schools that would serve their community. And so a double taxation, as it were, but that shows the importance of education to the black community in the years following the Civil War. You also had the development of schools that were for vocational training, industrial training, and teacher training, these normal schools. This was the main emphasis, and you see this in places like Hampton Institute in Virginia and Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. These were educational institutions predominantly training teachers, but also training African Americans to work in trades and skills more suited to industrial development. Now, this had two purposes. One is because they thought African American education should be practical, that it should be to developing them to be good workers and preparing them for trades and skills. On the other hand, it was also good for the teachers to know how to do this, not just so they could teach it, but because schools were limited. African American schools even more so in some cases following the Civil War, because many of the children went out and worked in the fields. And so they believed that the children needed to be trained industrially so that they could work in factories or in the fields, in agriculture. And so you needed to train the teachers to prepare them to train the students. So this had many different effects and many different reasons for why this was seen as a good way of teaching African American children. The John F. Slater Fund was also established. This is another philanthropic fund. And because the Peabody Fund didn't really reach out to African American schools, this is why the Slater Fund was important, because it did target African American schools in the South and promoted education. But it too, Slater was taken in by people like Booker T. Washington, a confidant of Washington's, who believed that industrial training was the right way of training African American children. Native American education similarly also developed during the period following the Civil War and during the Civil War itself. And a lot of this was because of the emphasis on assimilation. Now, there had been schools set up on reservations, but there was a problem. They really couldn't assimilate very well because the children always went home after school and would speak the language to their parents and maintain their cultural ways. And so educational reformists for Native Americans thought this was a bad idea. They wanted Indians to become Americans. And so they were fighting for greater assimilation. One of the ways they saw this was by establishing boarding schools off the reservation. And so one of the most famous of those is the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, established in 1879. And Richard Henry Pratt, the school's director, had been at Hampton Institute. He had taught there and learned there and was adapting some of these ideas about African American education, industrial education, and job preparation, and then applying these to his Native American students as well. And one of the most famous speeches, he said, we want to kill the Indian and save the white man inside. Kill the Indian, save the man. And this was an idea that assimilation was important in order to bring Native Americans into American society. On the other hand, one of the other issues that was driving this thought at the time was that there was serious consideration that Native Americans would soon become extinct. They were being exterminated during the following the Civil War, with the Native American War, the Indian Wars of the American West, ranging across New Mexico, the Dakotas, and other places. And there was a real downturn in Indian population. A lot of people were dying. And people feared that Indians were going to soon become extinct. And so assimilation was one way of preserving them in the society. It's open to criticism, but that was their thought. In the period following the Civil War, you see what we sometimes call the Second Industrial Age. And the Gilded Age, this idea of big businesses using new technology, new industry to grow and develop following the Civil War, the development of agricultural implements, farm implements to help farming become easier, the development of petroleum as a fuel and lubricant supply. In the 1870s with Rockefeller in the development of Pennsylvania refineries. And you also had a lot of immigration coming in to the United States, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. So there's a lot of changes going on. One of the ways this affected education was with the Hatch Act. What the Hatch Act did was this provided research opportunities for these agricultural state colleges. What they hoped would happen is that scientific research aimed at making crops more efficient and increasing output would take hold and spread to the farms. We also see some of the earliest attempts to develop a federal education agency. This actually did take place after the Civil War, but the next year it was demoted to a bureau and was lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of Washington, D.C. But one thing it did do was it began collecting data about education in the United States. You see the passage in some states of compulsory attendance laws to get children, to deal with children who were unemployed, to get them into schools, and make them go to school. And the idea of truancy, if you did not attend, you could be fined for that, your family could be fined for that. So to push students into schools. And this also had the effect of opening up more jobs for people by taking children out of the mix. The development and professionalization of the National Educational Association, this actually happened before the war, but it starts to grow and becomes more of a principals, superintendents organization, developing professional skills among these office holders. And then you see other reform movements. Now, we talked about some of the reform movements affecting Native Americans, African Americans, and not wealthy whites in the South, but you do see the beginning of other types of movements that are going to change schools. The university movement, the high school movement, the kindergarten movement. While today these are established parts of our K through 12 or K through 16, as we like to call it, pipeline of educational institutions, kindergarten all the way up through college. This really didn't start taking hold until after the Civil War, these ideas. And so you begin to see the university movement. This is, universities in the United States for the first time offering PhD certificates. A tremendous change, because previously if you wanted a PhD, you had to go to Europe. Now they're being offered in American schools. The development of the high school as a established school on its own as a link between colleges and elementary school. And the development of the kindergarten, the children's garden, adapted from Germany. This idea from Froebel that children needed to be developed, they needed to be stimulated intellectually so they could be prepared to learn. So the development of these schools, first in German areas of the United States, like Ohio, St. Louis, in that area, and then you have the first English language kindergarten also being established in those areas and begin spreading across the United States. So what were the effects of the Civil War on education? Well, there were mixed effects, but overall I think you can say is that you see greater centralization in school structure and organization and a larger federal role in education. How did education evolve following the Civil War during the Reconstruction period? Again, you do see increased state and local funding to schools, and of course this is also met by a lot of resistance because it means higher taxes in the South. But you see a growing idea of professionalism among teachers and educational professionals like superintendents and principals as well. So this idea of organizations and promoting professionalism within those organizations among all branches of educators. And increased centralization, as I've already said. A lot of this is due to making better business decisions because if you have such diversity and every school can do whatever it wants, you don't have as much buying power as you do if the schools are more centralized. And you see one of the ways that we adapt to new ethnic groups. I mentioned earlier Southern and Eastern Europeans who are coming in the New York area, but you also see the development of others, more Scandinavians coming in the Midwest. You see Asian immigrants on the West Coast, and even in the United States, you see a growth in Mexican Americans along the southwestern border region. And so you have these new ethnic groups coming in addition to the Native Americans, and many of them are going to be encouraging education within their own communities and becoming teachers so they can continue that trend. But you also see the development of the idea that industrial and teacher training was what they needed for their future. So thank you for listening. When we look at the next lecture, we're going to look at the effects of progressive education.